And just as in any time of inflation, hard assets, assets like gold and silver, become more attractive as a hedge against inflation, I think we're also seeing millions of people worldwide turning to Bitcoin as a hedge against inflation. One of the most important innovations of Bitcoin is that it's set at 21 million and exactly 21 million maximum Bitcoin, not 21 million and one. That line promises a finite supply. And at the end of the day, what is money? It's a deep and profound question, and there are bigger brains in this room than mine who can give insightful answers, but money is ultimately a medium of exchange. You think of the origins of money back in the hunter-gatherer days, when we had to rely on barter, when we had to rely on, you've got a sheep and I've got a chicken. And I'd kind of like a sheep and you'd kind of like a chicken. And so we could engage in a currency that if I carried 3 chickens under my arm and gave them to you, maybe you'd give me a sheep. Now, that worked in a limited setting, but it was kind of inconvenient to carry 3 chickens under your arm. And then you had to know, well, how many chickens is it if I want a bunch of bananas? And even worse, what if it's only part of a chicken? Barter had serious and obvious limitations. And so what is money? Money was an agreed upon uniform exchange rate that if we could agree that a sheep was $3 and a chicken was $1, then we could simply exchange that unit of currency and know the relative prices of one good to another. That works when the unit of currency is relatively stable. It becomes far less valuable when government decision makers are able to devalue that currency. So that's one of the many appeals of Bitcoin, is the stability of amounts. There's also an appeal of speed, the ability to instantly carry out a financial transaction anywhere in the world instantaneously and virtually costless. You think about the delays and costs it could entail if you want to wire some money from one person to the other, that it could take hours or days, imposing significant costs, whereas where Bitcoin can be transferred instantaneously. That poses an advantage, but it especially poses an advantage for the unbanked. Bitcoin is global. What does that mean? That means if you're a subsistence farmer in Honduras or in Africa, you may not have access to banking. You may not have a secure store of wealth. I guess if you have some money, you can dig a hole in your backyard and hope no one comes to find it. But part of the beauty of Bitcoin and crypto is it gives access to global finances, to buying and selling, to transferring value instantaneously no matter where you are. That's remarkable. And then there is the advantage of freedom. There's nobody in charge. That terrifies government decision makers. Pause for a second and reflect why communist China has banned Bitcoin. The answer is real serious, real simple. They can't control it. They don't like something they can't control. By the way, that is the exact same reason most Democrats don't like Bitcoin. Why does Bitcoin make Elizabeth Warren toss and turn and twitch at night? Because she wants her sticky little socialist fingers to be able to control every penny in every one of our bank accounts. By the way, that's the same thing Xi wants in China. Uncontrolled, decentralized currency is terrifying for those who want control of currency. You know, there was a revealing moment up in Canada when you had the Canadian truckers. By the way, what a fantastic, when in recent times have people talked about badass disruptive Canadians? I say this as someone born in Canada. Canadians are unfailingly nice and polite. I don't know what happened with me. They screwed up with me, sorry. But you look at those Canadian truckers who the eyes of the world were focused on those truckers standing up and saying, "What the hell are you doing trying to force me to make medical decisions about my life? It's none of your damn business." And we also saw the petty tyrants. We saw Trudeau coming down with the force of government on those individual citizens daring to speak out in one of the great exchanges. So there was initially crowdfunding until Silicon Valley agreed to obey the orders of government and cut off the funding. And basically announced it was going to steal the truckers' money. And so in response, people began contributing Bitcoin. And there was a wonderful exchange where the Canadian government demanded of one custodial outlet, hand over your client's information and hand over your client's Bitcoin. And they wrote a spectacular letter in response, which basically said the joy of a distributed ledger, we don't have control of it, we can't hand it over, we couldn't if we wanted to, and go piss off. That's a beautiful thing. Let me talk about something else, which is energy. So one of the criticisms of Bitcoin is it consumes too much energy. It takes enormous energy to mine Bitcoin, and the socialists of the world say, wouldn't it be better if that energy were spent on something else? Why should it be spent on enabling people to have financial independence and freedom? That's a terrible thing. Well, I actually think Bitcoin has an incredible potential to benefit us on the energy front. Let's take, for example, natural gas flaring. If you come out to the Permian Basin, West Texas. By the way, I encourage you, come out to the Permian Basin, West Texas. Incredibly productive. You come in as far as the eye can see, pump jacks, producing from one of the most incredibly productive reservoirs in the world. Now, on many of those instances, particularly if you come at nighttime, you'll look along and you'll see lights lighting up the horizon. Why is that? Because when you're producing oil, typically you produce natural gas along with it. Now that's great if you have a natural gas pipeline to capture that natural gas. But if you don't have a pipeline, you got a problem. Because you can't get the oil without the natural gas coming up. And if there's no pipeline, what do you do with it? Well, you have two options. You could release it in the atmosphere, which is terrible and not allowed. Or you can do what's called flaring. What is flaring? Literally lighting it on fire. So you look out over the horizon and you see flame after flame after flame, natural gas being flared. What does Bitcoin present the opportunity to do? At every one of those wells, capture that natural gas and use it to generate electricity that goes directly into mining, with a mining rig right next to the well. That prevents the flaring, which is good for the environment, and it produces value in terms of the Bitcoin that is generated. Now, that's a win-win across the board, but there are actually additional benefits beyond that. Because as you're engaging in that Bitcoin mining, if you're connected to the grid, the more Bitcoin mining you have, the greater resilience the grid has. Listen, we've seen year after year after year the frailties of the grid in California as they have rolling brownouts and rolling blackouts predictably. We saw, unfortunately, in the state of Texas with a massive freeze where the grid failed and millions lost electricity. One way to think of Bitcoin is as a battery. Why is that? Because if you're running rigs mining, consuming a significant amount of electricity, and suddenly there's a weather event or some other adverse event where the total store of electricity drops, those Bitcoin rigs can be turned off at a fraction of a second. And suddenly the energy that was going to Bitcoin mining can be instantly available to heat people's homes or cool people's homes or run businesses or keep the state going. Look, one of the challenges with electricity is it's very hard to store. Battery technology, we had a long way to go on battery technology. And so the grid is carefully calibrated between the electricity being produced and the demand. And where you have challenges on the grid are when you have a significant and unpredictable swing in one or the other. Either the supply drops or the demand spikes. And if that's unpredicted, that imbalance causes the challenges. Well, the beauty of Bitcoin, if you have a substantial amount of power generation going to Bitcoin mining, when the price of electricity exceeds the value that is being generated from mining Bitcoin at that point, those rigs can be turned off instantaneously, just like that vacuum cleaner. But there's also a value, you know, this notion of Bitcoin mining as a battery is an interesting concept because it's not just an incentive to remediate pollution, remediate carbon emission, to pollute less and capture that natural gas, but it's also an incentive for renewables. Look, eventually we will move away from oil and gas. I don't think it's going to be nearly as soon as the Green New Deal totalitarians want it to be. But there will come a time when we do. And if you look at renewables, one of the challenges of renewables is that the wind blows in a lot of places that are in the middle of nowhere, and the sun shines in a lot of places in the middle of nowhere. And if you want to create assets to capture that energy, if you want to create windmills, if you want to create solar panels, it's an enormous problem if there aren't energy transmission lines. A bunch of solar panels on a really sunny place without any power lines are useless because they generate electricity and yet that you can't transfer the electricity to the users. If you think of Bitcoin mining as a battery, you have the ability to erect windmills or solar panels, and next to them to put mining rigs, where the power being generated goes straight to Bitcoin mining. But if you think of Bitcoin, if you think of a battery as a reservoir of value, you turn that energy from the sun or the wind into capital, into an asset that has value. What that does is make it economically attractive to build the alternative energy facilities in the first place. That from the first solar panel you put up, you could start capturing value, which in turn, when you build a sufficient enough array that it's economically viable, then you can put power transmission lines in place. But it gives you a first dollar and first minute opportunity to yield reward from your investment. I think Bitcoin and crypto generally has the potential to demonstrate and to generate enormous returns across the country, but I also believe government can screw it up. I will say I've spent more and more time lately talking to folks in the Bitcoin community and crypto community. And I do think there is a little bit of a utopian naivete among folks in those worlds who believe, as Thanos said, we are inevitable. Well, maybe. But they may have thought that in China. Government has an enormous ability to screw things up. And I don't know how many of y'all have your El Salvadorian passports, but the U.S. federal government screwing it up would be massively destructive. And if you look at last year, when we were taking up the massive infrastructure bill, buried within that bill was one provision that had the potential to wreak havoc on Bitcoin, defining almost everybody in the process of Bitcoin mining as a broker, requiring them to collect information on their customers, even though in many instances you could not do so. I can tell you, I stood up on the Senate floor and offered an amendment to strip that provision from the bill. Here's the terrifying thing. In the entire U.S. Senate, I'd be surprised if there were 5 senators who could tell you what the hell a Bitcoin is. 2 of them, Cynthia and I, are standing in this room. And nobody would hire either one of us to program anything. Bismarck famously said there are 2 things you don't want to see being made: sausage and legislation. The ability of the United States Congress, with absolute whim and caprice, to potentially destroy trillions of dollars of value is terrifying. When I offered my amendment to strip that provision, I had the wild and crazy view that we should actually know something about the thing we're regulating before we pass a law potentially destroying it. When I offered that amendment, the Democrats objected. Cynthia and I, together, and several others, tried to do a second amendment that at least made it less harmful. Again, the Democrats objected. I would say the potential of government to mess this up, and by the way, the potential of this current administration to wreak enormous havoc when it comes to Bitcoin and crypto is difficult to overstate. So it's one of the reasons I'm really glad Heritage is hosting this, because it's easy to wake up. And by the way, how many of y'all remember Napster? Napster was unstoppable. It was inevitable until, boom, it was obliterated. And so if we see the potential for what Bitcoin represents, if we see the optimism, we need to be vigilant not to destroy it. Now, part of that is understanding the many policy questions and repercussions, whether it deals with tax treatment, whether it deals with regulatory treatment. There are big and hard new questions raised by Bitcoin and crypto generally. I hope this panel discussion will shine some light on some of those big and hard questions. But when it comes to something as consequential as this, I think we are well advised to proceed slowly and cautiously, with a recognition that wreaking havoc is a terrible outcome. Thank you.
Senator Cruz, great job. Thanks. We have time for a couple of questions because we have a couple of parts to this program. So I was going to ask you one, but I will defer to the audience. If you would, if you have a question, raise your hand. One of my colleagues will come around with a mic. You know the drill. So any questions? One all the way in the back. Yes, ma'am, right there in the middle. Raise your hand again. There you go. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, Tiana Law, Washington Examiner. So you talk about sort of the global capacity for Bitcoin's utility, independent of sort of price levels or any of that mattering. I do wonder what we're seeing right now in, as you pointed out, El Salvador, with the IMF putting a lot of threats on further restrictions for their currency capacities. We saw with Putin's invasion of Ukraine a lot of threats to try and destabilize Bitcoin in Russia, and obviously that's been a bulwark. But how even, it's not as though universal internet access is guaranteed, and it's not as though there is not a regulatory code that protects countries from ever coming under, the jurisdiction of the IMF. How does the U.S. sort of enhance Bitcoin's utility globally when those are very real threats to how it can be used?
Yeah, look, those are good questions, and I will say how different governments approach it is a question that's going to play out in the months and years to come. With a developing country like El Salvador making Bitcoin legal tender, that has enormous upsides. That potentially has some risks. But I understand why that's an attractive policy option to a government like El Salvador. It doesn't surprise me also that centralized banks and organizations like the IMF are skeptical of that. Any government agency that wants control is going to resist tools that make control more difficult. It's part of the same reason why you see there's a sizable number of regulators who don't like cash, who despise cash. Why? Because cash is uncontrollable. We saw in the Democrats' Build Back Broke bill, their proposal to require banks to report on every banking transaction that exceeds $600. Literally when you pay your rent every month. Unless any of y'all are college interns living with 7 roommates in D.C., you're spending more than $600 a month on your rent. And it would require every time you do that, heck, soon it's liable to be that to fill up a tank of gas. Yes, there will be ongoing efforts to increase government's ability to monitor what's happening. I think we should be resistant to those efforts. And that's not going to be a one-time resistance. I very much worry about the Biden administration and their taking marching orders from the voices in the Democratic Party like Elizabeth Warren.